"Don't hurt me. I'll do anything," she begged. But the giant cowboy didn't take a step closer. He took off his coat and wrapped it around her shaking shoulders. Out on the frozen trail, the wind cut like a knife, and the only sound was the clink of his spurs and her teeth chattering. Folks in town would have turned her away. He didn't. What he didn't know, what she couldn't yet tell, was that men were already riding hard to drag her back. Men who claimed her as property and wanted the land she had every right to call her own. In the lamplight of a one-room mission, a fire burned low and danger closed in. There was a paper somewhere, old, stamped, and worth more than gold, that could save her. But it had to be found before the snow melted and before the wrong hands sealed it away forever. When the law comes knocking, will he walk away like before, or fight for the woman he saved on the road? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The bitter Wyoming wind howled across the empty freight trail, cutting through Elias Brogan's clothes like icy daggers. His paint gelding plodded steadily through the deepening snow, each hoof leaving a crisp print in the white powder. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the frozen landscape as he made his way toward the rail camp, hoping to find work that would see him through the harsh winter months. A weak cry carried on the wind, so faint he nearly missed it. Elias pulled his horse to a stop, listening. There, another sound, more desperate this time. He turned in his saddle and spotted a figure stumbling through the snow, barefoot and barely dressed for the cruel weather. As he drew closer, he saw it was a young woman, her dress torn and dirty, her cheeks red from the biting cold. She stumbled backward when she saw him approach, holding up her trembling hands in surrender. "Don't hurt me," she pleaded, her voice quavering. "I'll do anything. Please." Elias studied her carefully from atop his horse. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old, with features that spoke of mixed heritage, European and Native American, if he had to guess. Her dark eyes held equal measures of fear and determination, though exhaustion seemed about to claim her. Without a word, Elias shrugged off his heavy sheepskin coat. The wind bit harder at him now, but he ignored it as he extended the warm garment toward her. She hesitated, disbelief crossing her face, before she accepted it with trembling fingers. "Much obliged," she whispered, wrapping the oversized coat around her shoulders. It dwarfed her small frame, but some color began returning to her face. "Name's Elias Brogan," he said quietly, keeping his voice gentle. "What brings you out here in such a state, miss?" She hugged the coat tighter, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting pursuit. "Clara Finch," she answered. "I ran from Pikes' freight shack. His foreman, he keeps me there. Says I owe passage debt, but the amount never gets smaller, no matter how much work I do." Elias's jaw tightened. He'd heard of such schemes before, crooked men trapping vulnerable people in endless cycles of supposed debt. His first instinct was to ride away. Getting involved in Pike's business meant trouble, and he'd seen enough trouble in his years as a Texas Ranger. He turned his horse, ready to leave this problem for someone else to solve. But something made him look back one more time. Clara stood there in his coat, snow gathering in her dark hair, her eyes following him with a mix of understanding and desperate hope. Elias sighed deeply, the sound almost lost in the wind. "There's a mission outside town," he said finally. "Reverend keeps it warm. Might have a space for you." Relief flooded Clara's face, though she tried to hide it. "I couldn't ask." "You ain't asking. I'm offering." Elias extended his hand down to her. "Come on. Light's fading, and this cold's fixing to get worse." Clara hesitated only a moment before grasping his hand. He helped her settle behind him on the horse, noting how she tried to maintain proper distance, despite the necessity of holding onto his waist to stay mounted. They rode in silence through the gathering dusk, the wind carrying the lonely call of coyotes across the snow-covered plain. The mission's single window glowed with warm lamplight, smoke curling from its stone chimney into the darkening sky. Reverend Noah Gray stood in the doorway before they even dismounted, as if he'd been expecting visitors on this bitter evening. The half-Cherokee preacher's kind face showed no surprise at their arrival, only concern as he took in Clara's condition. "Bring her inside," he said simply, holding the door wide. Heat from the crackling fire rushed out to meet them, along with the promising smell of cooking broth. Clara stumbled a bit as Elias helped her down, her feet nearly numb from cold. The Reverend immediately guided her to a chair by the fire, while Elias took care of his horse in the small lean-to stable. When he returned inside, Clara sat with a tin cup of steaming broth in her hands, some of the fear gone from her eyes. Reverend Gray moved quietly around the room, gathering extra blankets. "There's space in the women's loft," the Reverend said, nodding toward the ladder that led to the upper level. "It's warm up there and private. You'll be safe." Clara's hands tightened around the cup. "I don't know how to repay such kindness," she said softly, looking between the two men. "No repayment needed," Elias said firmly, thinking of the debt she'd fled from. "Just get warm and rest." A fierce gratitude filled Clara's expression, though she spoke no further thanks aloud. Instead, she sipped her broth and watched the fire, the shadows of her recent ordeal still visible in her eyes, but beginning to fade in the mission's peaceful warmth. Elias found himself lingering longer than he'd intended, telling himself it was just to make sure she'd truly be all right. He recognized the weight of the choice he'd made back on the trail, to help instead of turning away, to bring her to safety instead of leaving her to whatever fate awaited. It wasn't the easy choice, and it might bring trouble, but watching Clara's shoulders slowly relax as she warmed by the fire, he knew it had been the right one. Morning sunlight streamed through the mission's small windows, casting warm squares on the rough-hewn floorboards. The aroma of fresh coffee and hot cornbread filled the single room, making it feel more like a home than a way station. Clara sat at the simple wooden table, her borrowed shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, despite the warmth from the cook stove. Elias settled across from her, methodically cleaning his Colt revolver with practiced motions. The familiar routine helped him think while Clara spoke, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Pa always said the spring on our land belonged to everyone," she explained, watching steam rise from her coffee cup. "When the railway men started pushing the Shoshone families away from their winter camps, he stood with them. Said it wasn't right to break promises over water rights." Her fingers traced the rim of the cup. "The night Pa died, there were shots in the dark. Ma." She just seemed to fade away after that, like a flower without rain. By spring, I was alone. Reverend Gray moved quietly around them, setting out more cornbread. His presence seemed to give Clara courage to continue. "I thought I could make it to my uncle's place up north," she said, "but I ran out of money in town. Mr. Pike offered me work to pay for my passage." Her voice caught. "Only the debt kept growing instead of shrinking? Every week there were new charges, room and board, supplies, interest." Elias's hand stilled on his gun. He'd seen such schemes before, crooked men preying on the desperate. Part of him wanted to ride away from this trouble, but something in Clara's quiet dignity held him there. "You're welcome to stay here as long as needed," Reverend Gray said firmly. "The mission offers sanctuary to all who seek it." He spoke with the quiet authority that came from years of standing between the powerful and the vulnerable. Before Clara could respond, the thunder of hoofbeats shattered the morning peace. The door burst open with a bang that made the cups rattle. Harlan Pike filled the doorway, his bulk wrapped in an expensive fur coat. Two armed riders flanked him, hands resting too casually near their gun belts. "Well, well," Pike drawled, holding up a paper. "Quite a gathering for such an early hour." His smile didn't reach his eyes as he focused on Clara. "You've caused quite a stir, girl, running off like that. Lucky I found you safe and sound." Clara's spine straightened, though Elias noticed how her hands gripped the table's edge. Pike strode forward, his boots heavy on the floor. "Got everything nice and legal here," he announced, spreading the paper on the table. "Signed guardianship papers, on account of the substantial passage debt owed. Miss Finch being unmarried and without proper means, it falls to me to ensure her welfare and proper employment." Reverend Gray stepped forward, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles as he examined the document. "These papers seem rather hastily prepared," he said mildly, "and I believe Miss Finch's father left her property that would more than cover any legitimate travel expenses." Pike's smile tightened. "That so? Funny thing about frontier property, papers get lost, records burn. Far as the territory's concerned, that deed never existed." He turned to Clara. "Time to come along now. Can't have you imposing on the good Reverend's charity." "The mission offers shelter to all who seek it," Gray repeated firmly. "By law and by God's grace." Pike's face darkened. "Law's a funny thing out here, Reverend. Might want to think careful about whose side you're taking." He glanced at Elias, taking in the cleaned gun on the table. "Same goes for any drifters looking to play hero." Elias kept his voice level. "Ain't about taking sides, just about doing what's right." "Right?" Pike barked a laugh. "Right is what's written on paper, friend, and I got the only paper that matters right here." He tapped the guardianship document. Clara finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "My father's deed exists, Mr. Pike, and when it's found, your claim won't be worth the paper it's written on." Pike's false smile vanished entirely. "Best watch that tongue, girl. Wouldn't want folks thinking you're ungrateful for all I've done." He gestured to his men. "Fetch her." Elias's hand moved to his gun, but Clara caught his eye and gave a slight shake of her head. The tension in the room could spark into violence with one wrong move. Reverend Gray stepped between Pike's men and Clara. "The law allows 3 days of sanctuary," he said firmly. "Even a territory marshal would honor that. Unless you'd like me to send for one to review the situation?" Pike studied the preacher's calm face, calculating. Finally, he snatched up his paper. 3 days then. After that, either she comes willing, or things get considerably less pleasant. He turned to Clara. "Best spend the time thinking about what's real and what's just wishful thinking about lost deeds." The door slammed behind Pike and his men. Their horses' hoofbeats faded into the morning, leaving behind a heavy silence. Clara's shoulders sagged slightly, but her eyes held determination when she looked at Elias. "I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door," she said. "Both of you." Elias holstered his cleaned gun, thinking of his vow to stay clear of other people's fights, but watching Clara's quiet courage in the face of Pike's threats stirred something in him. Memories of other times he'd turned away, other wrongs he'd left unchallenged. "Reckon that deed's worth finding," he said finally, "if you'll have my help looking." Hope flickered across Clara's face, quickly tempered by caution. "It's not your fight," she said softly. "Maybe it should be," Elias replied. "Some fights need taking on, seems to me." Reverend Gray nodded approval. 3 days isn't much time," he said, "but the Lord can work wonders in 3 days, as we well know." Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, promising another clear winter day. Inside the mission, the coffee grew cold as they began to plan their search for the one piece of paper that could defeat Pike's scheme and restore Clara's rightful claim to her father's land. The afternoon light had begun to fade as Reverend Gray spread a weathered map across the mission's table. His finger traced the county lines while Clara and Elias listened intently. "Your father's deed could be in several places," the Reverend explained, adjusting his spectacles. "The county records office would have filed a copy, but—" He paused, frowning at the window where fat snowflakes were starting to fall. "There might be someone closer who kept records, too." Clara pulled her borrowed shawl tighter. "Who?" "There was an old surveyor who worked these parts, cautious man. He'd make copies of important papers, keep them safe in case of fire or flood. The Reverend rolled up the map carefully. But first, I'd suggest talking to Ahiana. She knew your father well, might remember something useful. Outside, the snow was falling heavier now, coating the ground in white. Elias led his paint gelding from the lean-to shelter, checking the cinch before mounting. The horse's breath came out in steamy puffs in the cold air. Clara emerged from the mission, wearing a thick wool cloak the Reverend had found. Her cheeks were already pink from the bitter wind, as Elias helped her up behind him. The gelding shifted, adjusting to the double weight. They rode in silence through the thickening snow, following a trail that wound through stands of bare cottonwoods. After 2 miles, smoke from a stone chimney came into view. A small cabin sat nestled against a hillside, its log walls weathered gray with age. A teenage boy appeared from behind the cabin, carrying an armload of split wood. He spotted them and called out something in Shoshone toward the cabin door. A moment later, a woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Clara? The woman's face brightened with recognition. Little Clara Finch? Clara slid down from the horse, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Ahiana, she said warmly, and the 2 women embraced. Ahiana pulled back to study Clara's face. You look so much like your mother. She gestured toward the cabin door. Come in, come in. Snow's getting worse. Inside, the cabin was warm and smelled of cooking venison. Ahiana's son added wood to the fire while his mother stirred a pot hanging from the crane. Clara and Elias sat at a simple table, their cold fingers wrapped around tin cups of hot tea. Your father was a good man, Ahiana said, ladling rich stew into wooden bowls. He understood the old agreements about the spring. Even when others tried to fence off the water, he said no. Said the Creator's gifts were meant to be shared? Clara nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I remember him saying that. That spring, Ahiana continued, sitting down with them, it never runs dry, even in the worst drought. The railroad men know this. She gave Elias a measuring look. That's why Pike wants the land so badly. Steam engines need water, and the creek in town runs low by summer. How did you know about Pike? Clara asked. His men have been asking questions, watching the trails to the spring. Ayana's son spoke up from his place by the fire. They don't like seeing our people water horses there anymore. Elias set down his spoon. Ma'am, the Reverend mentioned an old surveyor who kept copies of deeds. Would you know anything about that? Ayana nodded slowly. Samuel Whitaker? He retired to a place near town, but he was careful with papers. Said good records kept honest men honest. She smiled slightly. Your father trusted him. Outside, the early winter darkness was settling in. The snow fell steadier now, muffling all sound except the crack and pop of the cabin's fire. Elias stood reluctantly. We should head back before the trail gets too hard to follow. Clara rose too, pulling the borrowed cloak around her shoulders. Thank you, Ahiana, for everything. The older woman hugged her again. Be careful, child. Pike is not a man who gives up easily. She pressed a small bundle wrapped in cloth into Clara's hands. Pemmican, for the ride back. The snow had deepened when they mounted up again. Elias's gelding picked its way carefully along the trail, its hooves breaking through the crusty surface. Clara held tight to Elias's coat, her face tucked against his back to shield it from the wind. I'm sorry, she said after a while, her voice barely audible, above the horse's breathing. I never meant to drag anyone else into my troubles. Elias was quiet for several steps, guiding the horse around a fallen branch. Some things are worth the trouble, he said finally. Your father knew that. Standing up for what's right. He paused. Reckon I can do no less. They rode on through the gathering night, the mission's lamplight eventually appearing like a beacon through the swirling snow. Neither spoke again, but something had shifted between them, a shared purpose that went beyond mere duty or obligation. The gelding's hooves crunched through the snow as they approached the mission, where Reverend Gray waited with a lantern to light their way home. Tomorrow they would ride into town, seeking the surveyor and the proof of Clara's claim. But for now, they had learned what they needed to know. That this fight was about more than just one piece of land. It was about keeping promises, honoring the old ways, and standing together against those who would take what wasn't theirs to claim. The winter sun climbed higher as Elias and Clara rode into town the next morning. Their horses' hooves splashed through puddles of melting snow, turning the packed dirt streets into a muddy mess. The rail depot's steam whistle pierced the air, making Clara flinch slightly. "You sure you're ready for this?" Elias asked quietly. Clara nodded, straightening her borrowed dress. "I have to be." They dismounted outside the surveyor's small office, a weathered wooden building wedged between the general store and the telegraph office. A brass plate reading Samuel Whitaker, County Surveyor, Retired, hung crookedly on the door. The bell jingled as they entered. Inside, the office smelled of dust and old paper. An elderly man looked up from his desk, adjusting wire-rimmed spectacles on his nose. His back was stooped from years bent over maps and documents. "Mr. Whitaker?" Clara stepped forward. "I'm Clara Finch, Thomas Finch's daughter." Recognition brightened the old man's tired eyes. "Thomas Finch? Lord above, I haven't heard that name in years." He gestured to two wooden chairs. "Please, sit down." Elias remained standing, hat in hands, watching the street through the front window while Clara told her story. Whitaker listened intently, nodding at times, his expression growing troubled. "Your father was an honorable man," he said when she finished. "One of the few who treated everyone fairly, regardless of their background." He shuffled through some papers on his desk. "And you're right about the deed. I did make a copy, always did for important documents." Clara leaned forward eagerly. "Do you still have it?" Whitaker's face fell. "That's the trouble. When I retired last year, the railroad company bought my old office. All my files and furniture went into their storage room." He sighed heavily. "The deed copy would be in my old chest, oak with brass fittings. But Pikes' men keep that room locked tight now." "Where exactly is this storage room?" Elias asked, turning from the window. "Back of the rail office. Door faces the loading dock." Whitaker drew a rough sketch on a scrap of paper. "But mind yourselves, Pikes' foreman, Jenkins, he's a mean one. Caught him going through my old files more than once before I left." They thanked the surveyor and walked down the muddy street toward the rail depot. Clara's heart beat faster as they approached the large building. The storage room was visible from the street, a solid door with a heavy padlock. Pike's foreman stood on the office porch, tobacco juice staining his beard. His hand rested near his gun belt as he watched them pass. Clara felt his eyes burning into her back. "Keep walking," Elias murmured. "Don't give him reason to start trouble." They were nearly past when the foreman spat and called out, "Ain't proper for a half-breed to be wandering about decent folks' business district." Clara's steps faltered, but Elias's hand on her elbow kept her moving. His jaw was tight, but he said nothing until they were around the corner. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm used to it," Clara replied, though her voice shook slightly. They stopped at the general store for supplies. While Elias counted out coins for coffee and ammunition, the shopkeeper's wife slipped Clara a folded note. Outside, Clara read it quickly, her face paling. "What is it?" Elias asked. "She says Pike's been spreading stories about me in town. Says most folks here don't cotton to mixed families having land rights." Clara crumpled the note, blinking hard. "Says he's using that to get support for his claim?" Elias's expression darkened. "Some folks'll believe anything that lets them sleep better at night." He touched her shoulder gently. "But not everyone. Remember Reverend Gray. Remember Ahiana." The mission's cross came into view as they rode back, the afternoon sun gleaming on fresh snow. Reverend Gray met them at the door, hope fading from his face as they shook their heads. That evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread, they gathered around the mission's pot-bellied stove. Clara had gone upstairs to rest, leaving the men to talk strategy. "The deed's there in that storage room," Elias said, warming his hands near the stove. "But that lock's solid, and Jenkins watches it like a hawk." The Reverend stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Jenkins rides out every Thursday to check the line camps. Takes him most of the day." "That might be our chance." Elias stood, pacing slowly. "If we could get in while he's gone." "It would have to be quick," the Reverend warned. "And if you're caught?" "I know." Elias stared into the flames. "But we're running out of options. Pikes turning the town against her bit by bit. Soon there won't be anyone left willing to stand up for what's right." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the mission's windows. Upstairs, they could hear Clara's soft footsteps as she readied for bed. The Reverend added another log to the fire, sending sparks up the chimney. "Thursday, then," he said finally. "God help us all." The two men fell silent, watching the flames dance and considering the risks ahead. Neither spoke what they both knew, that finding the deed was only the beginning. The real fight would come after, when Pike discovered someone had dared to challenge his power over the town and its people. The following afternoon brought warmer air and melting icicles that dripped steadily from the mission's eaves. Clara sat by the window, mending a torn sleeve, when she spotted two figures approaching on foot through the slush. Her heart lifted as she recognized Ayana's familiar gait and the tall form of her teenage son beside her. "Reverend!" Clara called out. "We have visitors." Ayana's dark eyes were bright with purpose as she entered, snowmelt dampening the hem of her wool skirt. Her son, Joseph, carried a bundle of cured hides over one shoulder, but Clara knew trading wasn't their only reason for coming. "The foreman rides out today," Ayana said without preamble, accepting a cup of coffee from the Reverend. "He checks the line camps every Thursday, same as the season's turn." Elias stepped forward from where he'd been cleaning his revolver. "You're sure about this?" "My son watches the rail yard while hunting. The foreman always leaves before noon." Ayana's expression was steady. "We will keep watch while you search." Clara felt a surge of gratitude. This was how her mother's people had always been. Helping without being asked, seeing what needed doing, and simply doing it. The weight of their support wrapped around her like a warm blanket. They waited until the sun stood high overhead. Joseph, posted near the rail yard, returned with news that the foreman had indeed ridden out. Elias checked his gun belt, then nodded to Clara. Time to go. The storage room door faced away from the main street, half hidden by stacked lumber. Clara kept watch while Elias worked at the lock with tools borrowed from the mission's repair box. The padlock clicked open after several tense minutes. Inside, dust motes danced in the thin light from a single high window. The air smelled of old paper and leather. Crates and furniture crowded the space, chairs with broken legs, rusted tools, stacks of ledgers tied with twine. Clara's heart sank at the chaos. "There," Elias whispered, pointing to a corner. An oak chest with brass fittings sat partially hidden behind a roll of outdated maps. Together they shifted the maps aside, trying not to disturb the dust too much. The chest's lid creaked as they opened it. Clara's hands trembled as she sorted through the papers inside. Railroad manifests, property assessments, hand-drawn maps of creek beds and section lines. Then, near the bottom, she found it. A folded document, the paper yellowed, but still crisp. "This is it," she breathed, unfolding it carefully. Her father's name stood out clearly, Thomas Finch, along with the property description and his careful signature. Tears blurred her vision. Elias touched her shoulder gently. "We need to go." They wrapped the deed in a clean cloth and tucked it inside Clara's dress. After replacing everything exactly as they'd found it, they slipped out and locked the door. Clara's heart pounded until they were safely away from the rail yard. Ayana and Joseph met them on the mission's porch, relief clear on their faces. Inside, Reverend Gray examined the deed with careful hands, reading every line. "This will stand," he said finally, his voice firm. It's properly witnessed and filed. Pike can't deny its legitimacy. That evening, the mission's main room filled with warmth and friendly voices. Ahiana had brought venison stew, and other Shoshone families arrived with dried berries and fresh baked bread. A few townsfolk who'd known Clara's father stopped by. The blacksmith's wife, two cowhands who'd worked his range, an elderly couple who remembered his kindness during hard times. The reverend blessed the food in both English and Cherokee, his weathered face peaceful in the lamplight. Clara sat between Ahiana and the blacksmith's wife, their shoulders touching companionably as they shared plates of stew and stories about better days. For the first time in weeks, Clara felt herself truly relaxing. When someone mentioned her father's habit of singing off-key while he worked, she laughed out loud. The sound surprised her. She hadn't laughed since before her parents died. Across the room, Elias looked up at the sound. Their eyes met over the crowded table, and Clara felt a warm flutter in her chest at his smile. He'd loosened his collar in the warm room, and his usually serious face had softened in the friendly atmosphere. The evening stretched on pleasantly. Children played quiet games in the corner while the adults talked. The reverend brought out his fiddle, playing gentle hymns that brought a peaceful feeling to the gathering. Clara watched Ahiana teaching the blacksmith's wife how to string beads, their heads bent together over the work, and felt her heart swell with hope. This was how things could be, she thought. Different people sharing food and friendship, helping each other, choosing what was right over what was easy. The deed in her pocket was more than just a piece of paper. It was a chance to protect this kind of coming together. Later, as the visitors began heading home under a star-filled sky, Clara stood on the porch, watching them go. Elias joined her, his presence solid and reassuring at her side. "Thank you," she said softly, "for helping me, for believing me." Wasn't hard to believe, once I saw what kind of man Pike was. He paused, then added quietly, "And what kind of person you are." Clara ducked her head, feeling her cheeks warm despite the cold air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: filing the deed, facing Pike's anger, standing up to those who thought she had no right to her father's land. But tonight, surrounded by friends both old and new, she felt ready to face whatever came. Morning light crept through the mission windows, painting pale squares on the wooden floor. Clara sat at the rough-hewn table, needle flashing, as she worked on the borrowed cloak. The fabric was sturdy, but showed wear at the seams. Her mother had taught her that careful stitching could make old things last, and her fingers remembered the lessons well. Across the room, Elias settled on a bench, the steady scrape of whetstone against steel marking his progress as he sharpened his hunting knife. The familiar sound reminded Clara of mornings on her father's ranch, of tools being readied for the day's work. The memory brought both comfort and a sharp pang of loss. 2 days' ride to the territorial court, Reverend Gray said, marking the route on a creased map spread before him. Weather's easing some, though the wind still has teeth. Clara glanced out the window. The heavy snow had indeed lightened, but white-capped branches still swayed against a pearl-gray sky. The wind whistled through small gaps in the mission's log walls, carrying winter's chill despite the warmth from the pot-bellied stove. "We'll need to pack light," Elias observed, testing his knife's edge with his thumb. "But smart. Extra ammunition, dried meat, blankets, no telling what trouble we might meet." The Reverend nodded, his weathered face thoughtful. "Speaking of preparation?" He straightened, looking at them both. "I was thinking we might hold a service tonight. Thank the Lord for his guidance so far. Ask his blessing for the journey ahead." Clara's hands stilled on her sewing. The idea of gathering in prayer, surrounded by friendly faces, made her realize how much she'd missed the comfort of community worship. "That would be nice, Reverend." As afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow, people began arriving at the mission. Lamplight spilled from the windows, creating golden pools on the white ground. Clara helped the Reverend light more lamps, hanging them carefully, so their glow reached every corner of the main room. Ahiana arrived with several families from the Shoshone camp, their children's faces bright with excitement at the evening gathering. The blacksmith and his wife brought fresh bread, still warm from their hearth. Even old Mr. Harlan, the surveyor, made his way through the cold, leaning on his cane, but determined to attend. The familiar scents of wood smoke, coffee, and wool clothing filled the air as people shed their heavy coats and found places on the benches. Clara felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen as she looked around the room. These were good people, willing to stand with her despite Pikes' influence in town. Reverend Gray's voice, strong and clear, led them in the first hymn. Clara found herself joining in, the words coming back easily from childhood services. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. That saved a wretch like me? The blend of voices rose to the rafters. Deep bass, light soprano, the clear notes of children learning the tune. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, remembering how her father's voice would crack on the high notes and how her mother would smile, squeezing his hand anyway. Through the evening, they shared prayers and songs, scripture readings, and quiet moments of contemplation. Clara felt a fragile sense of safety returning, like a tender shoot pushing through spring soil. These walls, these people, this moment of peace. It felt like the first real shelter she'd known since her parents' deaths. But outside the circle of lamplight, beyond the mission's walls, darkness pressed close against the windows. Elias noticed it first, a shadow moving where no shadow should be, a hint of motion, just at the edge of sight. His hand dropped casually to rest near his holstered Colt. The service drew to a close as the evening deepened. People began gathering their things, wrapping children in scarves, trading quiet goodnights. Elias made his way to the door, scanning the ground as folks departed. Fresh boot prints circled the building, cutting through the new-fallen snow. Too many prints, too purposeful in their path to be from their evening visitors alone. After the last guest left, Elias carefully checked each window, drawing the curtains tight. He pulled the heavy bar across the mission door, testing its strength. His movements were calm but deliberate, years of ranger training evident in every careful check and double check. "Trouble?" Reverend Gray asked quietly, noting Elias's attention to security. "Maybe." Elias kept his voice low, though Clara could still hear him from where she folded the last of the hymn books. "Someone's been watching. More than one someone by the tracks." The Reverend's expression grew grave. "Pikes' men? Likely?" Elias checked his Colt one more time before settling onto his bedroll near the door. "We'll need to keep sharp eyes tomorrow." Clara pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders as she climbed to the women's loft. The sense of safety from earlier felt more fragile now, like frost patterns on a window pane. But she refused to let fear take root. They had the deed, they had friends, and they had right on their side. Whatever Pike planned, they would face it together. In the main room below, she could hear Elias shifting on his bedroll, positioning himself where he could watch both the door and windows. The Reverend's soft footsteps crossed to his small room, followed by the quiet creak of his bed. Outside, the wind continued its lonely song, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called into the night. The winter wind's mournful howl pierced the night, rattling the mission's windows in their frames. Elias lay on his bedroll near the door, drifting in and out of sleep, when a bitter scent jolted him fully awake. Smoke. His eyes snapped open as instinct kicked in, years of range experience telling him this was no ordinary wood smoke from the hearth. He rolled to his feet, scanning the room. Thin tendrils of gray seeped through gaps in the ceiling boards. Above, orange light flickered between the roof beams, casting hellish shadows. "Fire!" His shout carried through the mission. "Everyone out! Now!" Clara appeared at the top of the women's loft ladder, her borrowed shawl clutched tight. "Elias? Down. Quick!" He reached to steady her as she descended. The Reverend emerged from his room, already coughing from the thickening smoke. The fire's crackle grew louder, hungry flames now visible through widening gaps in the ceiling. Heat pressed down on them as Elias threw open the mission door. The bitter night air rushed in, feeding the blaze. Above them, the roof beams groaned. "The records!" Clara darted toward the reverend's desk. "The deed!" Elias grabbed blankets from a nearby bench, tossing them outside into the snow. "Get clear first." But she was already pulling open desk drawers, gathering papers. The commotion drew attention. Shouts erupted from nearby homes as people spotted the flames, lighting up the night sky. Boots crunched in snow as townsfolk rushed toward the mission. From the other direction came calls in Shoshone as Ahiana and others from the winter camp arrived. "Form a line!" someone yelled. "Get buckets to the well." A chain of hands quickly assembled, passing buckets and pots of water from the mission's well to those who could reach the flames. Steam hissed as water met fire, but the blaze had too strong a hold on the dry timber. Inside, Elias helped Clara salvage what they could: church records, medicine supplies, the few warm blankets they had for travelers. The smoke grew thicker, stinging their eyes and making every breath a struggle. Near the altar, Reverend Gray staggered, overcome by the smoke. His legs buckled as he tried to save his worn Bible and the mission's few silver communion cups. "Reverend?" Elias lunged forward as the older man collapsed. Without hesitation, Elias scooped up the Reverend's limp form. The man wasn't heavy, but the thick smoke made movement difficult. Elias ducked low, beneath the worst of it, and carried him toward the door. Outside, the cold air hit like a slap. "Here." Ahiana stepped forward, her practical hands already checking the Reverend's breathing. "Bring him to my lodge. We have medicines for smoke sickness." Two young Shoshone men helped carry the unconscious preacher while Ahiana hurried ahead to prepare. Clara emerged from the mission one last time, arms full of salvaged items, coughing hard. Above them, the roof was fully engulfed now, flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. The bucket line continued its work, but it was clear the mission's roof was lost. They could only try to save the walls and stop the fire from spreading to nearby buildings. The wind carried burning embers high into the night, each one a bright spark against the darkness. As dawn's first gray light touched the horizon, the fire's fury finally began to fade. The mission stood like a hollow shell, its roof gone, its walls scorched black. Steam rose from charred timbers where water had finally quenched the flames. The air still carried the acrid smell of burnt wood and smoke. Clara stood amid the wreckage of their sanctuary, her face smudged with soot, her borrowed shawl now singed at the edges. Her hands trembled as she sorted through the papers they'd managed to save. Suddenly her movements became more frantic. "The deed," she whispered, then louder. "The deed. It's not here." She turned to Elias, panic rising in her voice. "I saw it in the Reverend's desk yesterday, but it's gone." Elias strode to where the Reverend's desk stood, one leg broken, its surface water-stained and scorched. He yanked open each drawer, but found nothing. The document they'd risked so much to recover had vanished. The truth settled over them like ash. This was no accident. Pikes' men had used the fire as cover to steal their only proof of Clara's claim. Without the deed, she had no legal way to fight Pikes' guardianship. He held both her land and her safety in his grip. Clara sank onto a wet bench, her shoulders shaking. Not with tears, Elias realized, but with rage. "Everything my father built," she said through clenched teeth, "everything my mother's people trusted us to protect. That spring feeds half the valley in dry seasons." Elias knelt beside her, his voice low and fierce. "We'll get it back." He checked his Colt, making sure the dampness hadn't reached the powder. "Pike thinks he's won, but he doesn't know what he's started. I swear to you, Clara, we'll get that deed back." Around them, townsfolk and Shoshone neighbors were already gathering supplies: blankets, food, clean water. Someone had started a fire in a sheltered spot to brew coffee. Even in destruction, community endured. But Elias's mind was already racing ahead, planning. Pike would expect them to act quickly, anger driving them to foolish decisions. Well, he hadn't survived years as a Texas Ranger by being foolish. They would move carefully, deliberately, and when they did strike, Pike wouldn't see it coming. Dawn's light grew stronger, revealing the full extent of the mission's damage. The roof was completely gone, taking with it their sense of security. But as Clara stood, straightening her shoulders, Elias saw in her face the same determination he felt. They had lost this round, but the fight was far from over. Snow fell in thick curtains outside Ayana's cabin, piling against the sturdy log walls. Inside, warmth from the stone hearth barely kept the winter chill at bay. Reverend Gray lay on a pallet near the fire, his breathing labored but steadier than it had been 3 days ago. The smoke had burned his lungs raw, and his ribs bore purple bruises from his fall during the mission fire. Clara knelt beside him, wringing out a cool cloth to lay across his forehead. The Reverend's eyes fluttered open. "Child," he whispered, "you shouldn't risk staying. Pike will—" A coughing fit cut off his words. "Hush now," Clara said softly. "Save your strength." Elias stood at the window, watching the snow build. He'd spent the past days splitting firewood, helping Ahayana's son tend the horses, and keeping watch. The isolation of the cabin, tucked away from the main trails, had given them brief sanctuary, but he knew it couldn't last. The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air as Ahayana returned from town. Snow dusted her thick wool shawl, and her face bore the tight lines of worry. She set down her trading pack and moved to warm her hands by the fire. "What news?" Elias asked, noting her expression. Ahayana's voice was grim. "Pike has posted papers in town. Wanted notices." She pulled 2 crumpled sheets from her coat. "For both of you." Clara rose from the Reverend's side, taking one of the notices. Her fingers trembled as she read. "They're saying I set the fire? That I burned down the mission?" Elias took the other notice. There was his name, clear as day, charged with harboring a fugitive. His jaw tightened as he read the details. How they'd twisted everything around, making it seem like Clara had destroyed the mission to cover up theft, and he'd helped her escape justice. "There's more," Ahayana said, settling on a wooden stool. "Marshal Tate pulled me aside at the trading post. He's a good man, doesn't believe Pike's lies, but he has his orders." She looked at Clara with maternal concern. "If they catch you, Pike plans to put you on the first train east. Says it's for your own protection as his ward." "East?" Clara's voice cracked. "But the land, the spring—" "Would be his," Elias finished, "with you gone and no deed to prove otherwise." The Reverend tried to sit up, triggering another coughing spell. Clara helped ease him back down, but his eyes were fierce, despite his weakness. "The deed must be in Pike's office," he managed. "He wouldn't trust it anywhere else." Elias moved away from the window, his mind working. Pike's camp has 3 buildings: main office, supply shed, and bunkhouse. Office would be locked at night, but there's always someone in the bunkhouse. 2 guards most nights, Ahayana added. They drink heavy after supper. Clara stood, brushing off her skirts with determination. "Then that's when we go. At night." "We?" Elias turned to her sharply. "You're not coming. It's too dangerous." "It's my fight," Clara said, lifting her chin. "My father's land, my mother's people's water rights. I won't hide while others risk themselves for me." Elias started to argue, but something in her eyes stopped him. He recognized that look, had seen it in other eyes just during his ranger days. The steel that came when someone had lost everything except their determination to make things right. "She should go," Ayana said quietly. "She knows her father's papers, what to look for. And 2 sets of eyes are better than 1. The wind howled outside, rattling the cabin's shutters. Night would fall soon, bringing deeper cold but also cover. Elias checked his gun belt, then looked at Clara. "You follow my lead, If I say run, you run. No questions. Clara nodded, already moving to gather what they'd need. Ahiana helped her into a dark wool coat, then pressed something into her hands, a small knife in a beaded sheath. My husband's, she said. For luck. The Reverend watched them prepare, his breath wheezing slightly. Be careful, he managed. Pikes not a man to show mercy? Neither am I, Elias said quietly, when it comes to protecting what's right. They waited until full dark, when the snow and wind would help mask their approach. Ahiana and her son would keep watch over the Reverend, ready with horses if they needed to flee quickly. Clara hugged the older woman goodbye, the gesture speaking volumes about the bond that had grown between them. As they stepped out into the storm, Clara pulled her scarf higher against the cold. Ready? She asked. Elias nodded, checking his gun one last time. Stay close, and remember, whatever happens, we're in this together now. They moved into the swirling snow, two shadows among many in the gathering night. Behind them, a single lamp burned in Ahiana's window, a beacon to guide them home, if they succeeded. And if they failed? Well, Elias preferred not to dwell on that. They had a deed to find, and justice to reclaim. Everything else would have to wait. The moon hung behind thick clouds as Elias and Clara guided their horses along the frozen creek bed. Their mounts' hooves crunched softly in the crusty snow, the sound muffled by the wind whistling through bare branches. They had waited until well past midnight to make their approach, hoping Pikes' men would be deep in their cups by then. Clara's borrowed mare snorted, her breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The animal seemed to share her rider's tension. Clara sat straight-backed in the saddle, every sense alert. Beside her, Elias rode with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life horseback, but his hand never strayed far from his holstered Colt. There, he whispered, pointing through the trees. The rail camp sprawled ahead, dark shapes of buildings barely visible in the gloom. A bonfire blazed between the bunkhouse and supply shed, casting orange light across the packed snow. Around it, several of Pike's men slouched on crates and fallen logs, passing bottles between them. Elias guided them into a stand of cottonwoods, where they could watch unseen. The ancient trees creaked overhead, their bare branches casting strange shadows. Clara dismounted carefully, leading her mare deeper into cover. The horse's flanks trembled with cold or nervous energy, perhaps both. 4 men, Elias murmured, counting the figures by the fire. No sign of Pike himself. They watched for nearly an hour as the men drank and told loud stories, but saw no movement near the office building where the deed might be hidden. The temperature dropped steadily until Clara's teeth chattered despite her layers of wool and fur. The office looks dark, she whispered. Could we? Elias shook his head. Too risky. One of those men gets up for relief, we'd be trapped between them and the building. He squinted through the shadows, and something's not right. Pike's too careful to leave things unguarded. As if confirming his suspicion, a match flared briefly in a window of the office building, someone keeping watch inside, out of the cold. Clara's shoulders slumped. They would find no deed here tonight. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten when they finally returned to Ahiana's cabin. Their horses were tired and frost-rimed, and Clara's fingers felt frozen solid despite her thick mittens. Inside, the cabin was warm and dim, smelling of pine smoke and brewing coffee. Reverend Gray sat propped up in a chair near the hearth, looking stronger than he had in days. His breathing was clearer, though he still held himself carefully to protect his injured ribs. Ahiana's son tended the fire while his mother stirred something that smelled like venison stew. No luck? The Reverend asked, noting their expressions. Elias shook his head, helping Clara out of her frozen outer layers. Office was watched. Deed wasn't where we thought. Perhaps, Reverend Gray said slowly, we've been looking in the wrong place. He paused to sip from a steaming cup. The depot office might be more likely. Pike does most of his business there during the day. Or he might even carry it himself, not trusting anyone else. Clara sank onto a stool, accepting a cup of coffee from Ahiana. But how could we possibly search either place? The depot's busy all day, and Pikes never alone. 3 days from now, Ahiana spoke up, is railroad payday. Pike always holds a celebration at the depot. Free whiskey, cards, music. Many men drunk, not paying attention. Elias considered this, warming his hands by the fire. Could work, everyone distracted, papers maybe not locked up so tight. He looked at Clara. But it would still be dangerous, one wrong move. I'm not afraid, Clara said, though her hands tightened around her cup. We have to try something. The Reverend nodded approvingly. The Lord helps those who help themselves, though I expect he'd appreciate careful planning as well. They spent the next 2 days preparing, watching the weather and gathering what information they could. Clara kept her hands busy helping Ahiana's son chop and stack firewood, the physical labor helping to steady her nerves. The young man worked quietly beside her, his presence reassuring without need for words. In the evenings, they gathered around the hearth, speaking in low voices about the depot's layout, guard patterns, and possible escape routes. Elias cleaned his gun repeatedly, a habit Clara had noticed he fell into when thinking deeply. The Reverend's strength returned gradually, though he tired easily. His prayers grew longer each night, asking not just for success, but for protection and wisdom. Through it all, snow continued to fall intermittently, building drifts against the cabin walls and muffling the world outside. The forced waiting was both blessing and torture. Time to plan carefully, but also time for doubt to creep in. Clara found herself touching the small knife Ahiana had given her, drawing comfort from its solid presence. 2 more days, Elias said on the second evening, studying the rough map they'd drawn of the depot grounds. We'll need to move fast once we're inside. Clara nodded, trying to memorize every detail they'd gathered. Her father's land, her mother's people's water rights, and her own future all depended on what would happen when those 2 days were up. She could only pray they were making the right choice. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting long shadows across the cabin's walls. Outside, an owl called once, a lonely sound in the winter night. They had their plan now. All that remained was to wait, and to hope it would be enough. The winter sun rose crisp and bright over the Wyoming territory, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gleaming white and gold. Icicles dripped from the eaves of buildings in town as the temperature slowly climbed, though the air remained bitter cold. The saloon's swinging doors hadn't stopped moving since dawn, with railroad men filing in and out, their pockets heavy with fresh pay. Through the cabin's frosted window, Clara watched a line of workers snake its way to the paymaster's office in the rail yard. Their breath formed clouds in the morning air as they stamped their feet and rubbed their hands together, waiting for their wages. Even from this distance, she could hear the occasional burst of laughter or fragment of song. Payday put most men in high spirits. More activity than usual, Elias observed, standing beside her at the window. His voice was low, mindful of the Reverend still sleeping in the corner. Pike's celebration will draw quite a crowd tonight. Clara nodded, her fingers worrying at the frayed edge of her borrowed shawl. That's what we need, isn't it? Witnesses who can't be bought or scared into silence? Before Elias could answer, a quiet knock at the door made them both turn. Ahiana moved silently across the cabin floor, checking through a gap in the boards before opening it. A young man in a rail clerk's uniform slipped inside, removing his cap with trembling hands. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his face was red from the cold. Thomas Harper, he introduced himself in a whisper, glancing nervously at the sleeping Reverend. Mrs. Ahiana said I could trust you? Elias gestured him closer to the fire, where the clerk's shaking gradually eased. Clara poured him a cup of coffee, which he accepted gratefully. His hands were ink-stained, and he couldn't have been more than 20 years old. I've been keeping something, Harper said after a few sips, his voice steadying. something Mr. Pike's been searching for. He set the coffee cup down and looked directly at Clara. The original deed to your father's land? Clara's heart jumped. You have it? But how? I process all the property documents that come through the rail office, Harper explained. When Pike started asking about your father's land, something felt wrong. The way he talked about it. About you? He shook his head. I've seen him do this before. Use paperwork to steal what isn't his. So when the deed crossed my desk, I hid it. That was brave, Elias said quietly, studying the young man. And dangerous. Harper laughed shakily. Believe me, I know, I've barely slept since. But I couldn't let him take another family's land. Not after what happened to the Wilsons last spring. He straightened his shoulders. I can bring it tonight during the celebration. Pike will be busy playing host, showing everyone what a generous boss he is. Why not give it to us now? Clara asked. Because if I just hand it over, Pike will claim it's forged or stolen. But if you take it publicly, with the marshal present... Harper leaned forward earnestly. He'll have to acknowledge it. There will be too many witnesses, too many questions if he doesn't. Elias crossed his arms, considering. The marshal's been avoiding this fight. You think he'll stand up to Pike with a crowd watching? Marshal Thompson is a proud man, Harper said. He doesn't like how Pike uses him, but he needs proof before he can act. Give him that proof in front of the whole town, and he'll do what's right. They discussed the details as the morning wore on. Harper would bring the deed to the saloon at 8 o'clock, when the celebration would be in full swing. Clara and Elias would need to time their entrance carefully, late enough for Pike to have started drinking, but not so late that the marshal might have left. After Harper departed, slipping away as quietly as he'd come, the cabin fell into an expectant hush. Clara found herself watching the sun's slow arc across the sky, each hour bringing them closer to what felt like an ending, though whether good or bad, she couldn't say. In the afternoon, she noticed a tear in the sleeve of Elias's coat, probably caught on a nail or branch during their nighttime scouting. Without a word, she took out Ayana's sewing kit and gestured for him to hand over the garment. He did so with a grateful nod, settling into a chair nearby as she worked. The familiar motion of needle and thread helped calm her racing thoughts. The cabin was quiet except for the soft pop of the fire and the reverend's improved breathing as he dozed. Ayana had gone to town with her son to gather information, leaving Clara and Elias alone with their thoughts. My mother taught me to sew, Clara said softly, her fingers steady as she pulled the thread through. She said every stitch should be a prayer, for the person who'd wear it, for the work they'd do in it. Elias watched her work, his expression thoughtful. What are you praying for now? Protection, she admitted. Wisdom. Courage. She tied off a neat knot and bit the thread. For both of us. He accepted the mended coat, running a finger along her careful stitches. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. Clara packed away the sewing supplies, trying not to think about how this quiet moment might be their last peaceful one for a while. She also said that sometimes the strongest thread is the one that mends what's broken. Elias nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. They both knew that tonight wasn't just about a piece of paper. It was about mending broken promises, broken laws, broken trust between neighbors. The deed was just the thread they needed to start stitching things right again. The afternoon light began to fade, throwing long shadows across the cabin floor. Soon they would need to prepare for their journey into town, but for now, they sat in companionable silence, watching the fire and measuring their breaths against the ticking of Ayana's clock on the mantel. Each tick brought them closer to their confrontation with Pike, closer to justice or disaster. Only time would tell which. Evening settled over the town like a heavy blanket, bringing with it the deep chill of a Wyoming winter night. Oil lamps and lanterns cast yellow pools of light across the snowy main street. their glow catching the steam of horses' breath and the frost forming on window panes. From inside the saloon, raucous laughter and the tinny sound of a piano spilled out into the darkness. Clara adjusted the rough wool scarf that covered the lower half of her face, her hands steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Beside her, Elias looked different in his borrowed freight hauler's coat, his own face similarly concealed. They'd smudged their clothes with axle grease and trail dust to complete the disguise. "Ready?" Elias asked quietly, his voice barely carrying over the noise from inside. Clara nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Ready?" They pushed through the swinging doors into a wall of warmth, tobacco smoke, and noise. The saloon was packed with railroad men celebrating their pay, their voices raised in competing songs while cards slapped against worn wooden tables. The air was thick with pipe smoke and the sharp smell of whiskey. Through the haze, Clara spotted Harlan Pike holding court at the far table. He sat like a king among his men, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his elbow. His laugh boomed across the room as he dealt another hand of cards, his face flushed with drink and satisfaction. Elias led the way to the bar, shouldering between two railroad workers who barely noticed them. They ordered whiskey they wouldn't drink, maintaining their cover as they waited. Clara's heart pounded so hard she was sure others must hear it, even over the din. Minutes crawled past. A group near the piano started another song, something about a lost love and a long trail home. Clara noticed the marshal standing near the door, watching the room with practiced disinterest. Everything hinged on his reaction when the moment came. Finally, Thomas Harper appeared at their side, his clerk's jacket exchanged for plain workman's clothes. Without making eye contact, he slid a folded paper across the bar's scarred surface. Clara's fingers closed around it, tucking it securely into her cloak. The deed felt warm against her chest, as if it carried some of her father's spirit within its creases. But Pike's sharp eyes had caught the movement. He surged to his feet, whiskey sloshing as he slammed his glass down. "Clara Finch!" he roared, the name cutting through the saloon's noise like a knife. The piano fell silent. Conversations died. All eyes turned toward them as Pike stalked forward, his face darkening with rage. "Thought you could sneak in here, did you? Come to steal from me again?" Elias stepped smoothly between them, his hand not quite touching his gun. "Nobody's stealing anything, Pike." "That's my ward you're protecting, Brogan," Pike snarled, close enough now that Clara could smell the whiskey on his breath. "My property, by law and right, and you're harboring a fugitive who burned down the mission." "That's a lie." Clara's voice rang clear as she pulled down her scarf, facing Pike directly. The saloon had grown so quiet she could hear the wind whistling through a crack in the window. "You're the one who set that fire. You're the one who's been stealing. Land, lives, futures. And there are witnesses who saw your men that night." Pike's laugh held no humor. "Witnesses? You mean those Shoshone friends of yours? No court will take their word over mine. I'm bringing progress to this territory. The railroad needs that water source, and I mean to have it." "The railroad needs water," Clara agreed, her voice steady though her hands shook slightly. "But not at the cost of theft and fraud." She raised her voice to carry across the room. "There are Shoshone families outside right now who saw you burn the mission to destroy my father's deed, but you failed." The marshal pushed away from the wall, his spurs ringing against the wooden floor. "Those are serious accusations, Miss Finch. You got any proof to back them up?" Clara pulled the deed from her cloak, holding it high so everyone could see. "This is the original deed to my father's land, signed and witnessed, the one Mr. Pike tried to destroy. It proves he has no claim to my property or to me." The marshal crossed the room slowly, his weathered face unreadable, as he took the document. The entire saloon seemed to hold its breath as he unfolded it, holding it close to a lamp to study the signatures and seals. Pike's face had gone from red to white. "That paper's worthless. Forged. She's trying to cheat the railroad out of its rightful—" "This deed is genuine," the marshal cut him off, his voice hard. "I recognize Judge Watson's seal, and I witnessed this document myself 5 years ago." He looked at Pike with cold eyes. "You've been lying to me, Harlan, using my office to push through false claims." "You can't prove I burned anything," Pike blustered, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "No," the marshal agreed, "but I can arrest you for fraud and false imprisonment, and I reckon once folks start talking, more charges might surface." He turned to 2 deputies who had materialized from the crowd. "Take him to the jail. We'll sort this out proper in the morning." Pike lunged suddenly, not toward Clara, but toward the deed in the marshal's hand. Elias moved faster, catching Pike's arm and twisting it behind his back. The big man roared in fury and pain as the deputies rushed forward to help secure him. "The spring belongs to everyone," Clara said firmly as they led Pike away. "Just like my father intended, the railroad can draw water, but so can the ranchers and the Shoshone camps. That's what the deed promises, and that's how it's going to be." The marshal held the deed closer to the lamp, his weathered fingers tracing over the official markings. The saloon remained hushed, dozens of faces watching as he examined each detail. Finally, he looked up, his expression grave. "This here's the legitimate county seal," he announced, voice carrying to every corner of the room. "And Judge Watson's signature, I'd know it anywhere. Been seeing it on warrants for 15 years. He turned to face Pike, who stood rigid between the deputies. "Which means those guardianship papers you showed me last month were as fraudulent as a $3 bill." Pike's face twisted. "You're a fool, Jenkins. That girl's nothing but a half-breed troublemaker trying to block progress." "That's enough," the marshal cut him off sharply. "The only trouble I'm seeing came from you, Harlan. Forging papers, false imprisonment, suspected arson." He nodded to his deputies. "Take him to the jail. We'll sort out the full charges come morning." Pike's muscles bunched. With a roar, he lurched forward, trying to snatch the deed from the marshal's hand. But he'd telegraphed his move too clearly. The deputies grabbed his arms, their boots scraping against the wooden floor as they wrestled him back. Pike's face grew purple with rage as they secured his wrists with iron cuffs. "You can't do this to me," he bellowed, as they dragged him toward the door. "I run this town. The railroad needs that water." Clara watched him go, her legs trembling beneath her skirts. The danger that had shadowed her for months was finally being led away in chains. Around the saloon, conversations erupted in harsh whispers. Railroad men who'd feared Pike's influence now spoke openly of his schemes and bullying. Through the windows, Clara could see a crowd gathering in the snowy street. Ahiana stood with several Shoshone families, their breath visible in the cold air. Railroad workers clustered nearby, many of them men who'd suffered under Pike's harsh rule. The news of his arrest spread quickly through their ranks. Elias's arm slipped around Clara's shoulders, steady and warm. "Let's get you out of here," he said softly. She nodded, suddenly exhausted. The marshal caught her eye as they passed, touching his hat brim in respect. They stepped out into the crystal-sharp night. The crowd parted, creating a path. Several people reached out to touch Clara's arm or shoulder in support. Ahiana pressed close, speaking quiet words of blessing in Shoshone. Her teenage son grinned broadly, clearly enjoying Pike's downfall. Fresh snow had begun to fall, fat flakes drifting lazily through the yellow light of the street lamps. The white blanket softened the harsh edges of the town, muffling sounds and smoothing the rutted street. Clara's boots crunched through the new powder as Elias guided her away from the commotion. They walked in companionable silence toward Ahiana's cabin. The tension of the past week seemed to melt away with each step, like ice thawing in spring. When Clara stumbled, weary from the night's events, Elias's arm tightened protectively around her shoulders. The cabin windows glowed with welcome warmth. Inside, the reverend had kept the fire well fed, and the main room was cozy. He looked up from his Bible as they entered, reading their expressions. "It's done then?" he asked quietly. Clara nodded, sinking onto a chair near the hearth. Pikes in jail. The marshal recognized father's deed right away. Her voice caught. It's really over. Elias hung their snow-dusted coats near the fire to dry. The marshal will want statements tomorrow, but tonight we can rest easy. Ayanna bustled in from the back room with cups of steaming tea. The aromatic herbs she'd added filled the cabin with a soothing scent. Clara wrapped her cold fingers around the warm cup, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. They sat in peaceful quiet, the only sounds the crack of burning wood and the soft whisper of falling snow against the windows. No one felt the need to fill the silence with words. The victory they'd won spoke loudly enough. Clara studied Elias's profile in the firelight. The strong line of his jaw had become dear to her over these weeks of struggle. He'd stood beside her when he could have ridden away, fought for her land when he had no stake in it. Now he met her gaze, his eyes warm with understanding of all that had changed between them. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the tracks of the past and leaving clean white pages for new stories to be written. But that was for tomorrow. Tonight was for sitting by the fire, safe among friends, knowing that justice had finally been served. The reverend smiled gently at them both, then returned to his Bible reading. Ayanna hummed softly as she mended by lamplight. Her son had already fallen asleep in the corner, snoring quietly. The cabin held them all in its warm embrace as the night deepened and the world grew softer with snow. The week after Pike's arrest brought change to Sweetwater Valley as swift and steady as the spring thaw. Word traveled through town and along the rail line that Clara Finch had rightfully reclaimed her father's ranch. Even the most skeptical townsfolk had to acknowledge the truth when they saw Pike behind bars, and the official deed recorded in the county books. At Ayanna's cabin, where the reverend still rested, his breathing grew stronger each day. Though his ribs pained him, his eyes brightened whenever visitors brought news of the community's response. Clara sat beside his cot one afternoon, sharing her plans for the ranch. "The spring water belongs to everyone," she explained, pouring him fresh tea. "Father always said that. I aim to keep it that way." The reverend's smile deepened the wrinkles around his eyes. "Your father would be proud. Both your parents would." Outside, hammers rang against wood as workers repaired the mission's fire-damaged roof. Elias had organized the effort, bringing together railroad men eager to make amends for Pike's actions and Shoshone neighbors, who considered the mission a second home. The sound of their cooperation echoed through the valley. From her spot by the window, Clara watched Elias direct the work. He moved with sure confidence, helping lift heavy beams and showing younger men how to lay shingles properly. His strength drew others to him naturally, but it was his quiet kindness that made them stay. When he caught her watching, he tipped his hat with a small smile that made her heart flutter. She turned back to her conversation with the reverend, cheeks warm despite the winter chill. That afternoon, Clara walked the snowy path to her father's ranch house. Most of it still stood, though the windows were broken and the porch had partially collapsed. She climbed carefully up the creaking steps, remembering summer evenings when her mother would sit there, teaching her to bead moccasins, while her father told stories about his cattle drives. The sound of boots on snow made her turn. Elias approached, his breath visible in the cold air. "Thinking about repairs?" he asked, joining her on the porch. Clara nodded. "It needs work, but the bones are good. I want to make it a home again." She paused, then added, "I've been talking with Ayanna about setting up fair agreements for the spring water, making sure Shoshone families have guaranteed access like in Father's time." "That's good thinking." Elias studied the weathered boards beneath their feet. "Have you considered having someone help you run the place? Ranching's hard work for one person." A smile tugged at Clara's lips. "Well, that depends on who's asking." Their eyes met. Something warm and certain passed between them, melting the last of winter's chill from Clara's heart. That evening, Clara helped Ayanna prepare dinner, while her son tended the horses. The cabin glowed with lamplight and the scent of cooking. When Elias stepped in from the cold, She could tell something was on his mind. After the meal, while Ayanna and her son visited the reverend in the back room, Elias asked Clara to step outside. The night was clear and cold, stars scattered like silver beads across black velvet. Their boots crunched in the snow as they walked a few paces from the cabin. Elias cleared his throat. "Clara, I ain't much for fancy words, but I reckon we've faced enough together to know what matters." He took her hand in his, rough palm warm against her fingers. "I love you. Would you consider making a life with me? Running the ranch together?" Clara's heart swelled. In his face, she saw everything she'd come to trust: strength, honor, and a gentleness that matched her own. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would." He pulled her close, and their kiss was warm, despite the frosty air. Through the cabin window, Clara glimpsed Ayanna watching with approval, while her son pretended not to notice. The reverend's soft prayers drifted out into the night, blessing this new beginning. The rebuilt mission glowed with morning light filtering through fresh glazed windows. Reverend Gray stood at the altar, his voice strong again after weeks of healing. The pews held a blend of faces that would have seemed impossible just months ago: Shoshone families in their finest dress, railroad workers' polished boots, and townsfolk who had chosen to stand with truth over prejudice. Clara wore a cream-colored dress that Ayanna had helped her sew, adorned with beadwork that honored her mother's people. Her dark hair was braided with ribbons, and her eyes shone with joy as she walked down the aisle. Elias waited at the front, tall and proud in his best black coat, his usual quiet manner softened by the smile he couldn't contain. The Reverend's words filled the simple space. "We gather here to join these two souls, brought together by God's grace through storm and struggle, now finding harbor in each other's hearts." Clara's voice was clear and steady as she spoke her vows. Elias's deeper tones carried through the mission as he promised to cherish and protect her all his days. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, the gathered community erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the new rafters. After the ceremony, the entire congregation made their way through the melting snow to the ranch house. Clara and Elias had worked alongside friends for weeks to restore it, and now the home welcomed guests with warmth and light. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes brought by every family: venison stew, fresh bread, pies, and traditional Shoshone foods that Clara's mother would have loved. Children played in the yard, while adults shared stories and laughter. The rail clerk, who had helped expose Pikes' schemes, sat comfortably between Ayanna's family and the marshal, sharing coffee and conversation. Even the most hardened townsfolk found themselves warming to the spirit of community that filled the air. As evening approached and the light began to fade, guests gradually said their goodbyes. The last wagon sounds faded into distance, leaving Clara and Elias standing on their porch. The air had grown colder, and soft snowflakes began drifting down in the dim light, catching on Clara's hair and eyelashes. Elias watched her shiver slightly in her wedding dress. Without a word, he shrugged off his sheepskin coat, the same one he had offered her that desperate day on the freight trail. He wrapped it around her shoulders, just as he had done when they first met. The familiar weight and warmth of it brought tears to Clara's eyes. "You never had to do anything," he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. "You just had to be worth protecting." He pulled her close, his arms strong and sure around her. Clara leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Below them, the valley stretched peaceful and pure under its new blanket of snow. The spring bubbled faithful and clear, ready to nourish all who came in friendship. In that moment, she knew with bone-deep certainty that their hearts, like the land itself, had found their true home, safe at last, and ready to grow together through all the seasons to come. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.